sequence.
Boom. 5, 3, 2, 1. All righty then. Welcome to another edition of This and That. We're doing this on the 15th of June. And we've been continuing to look at summaries of Marx's Capital. And given that not a lot of people are doing the heavy duty reading that probably not necessarily should be done, because as I think if you've seen in the summary that there are certain sections of volume 2 that are not so much that they're boring. It's just that, I think from an editing point of view, Engels decided, well, let's just leave this in. It's got a lot of diagrams and crap, so maybe that'll be okay. Truly, to look at the 3 volumes of Capital is to look at something that's not quite finished, and noting, as others have, that the original project was a 6-volume project with lots of history and probably something a little bit more intense. But it's a historical document, and it is as it is. On the other hand, entire regimes have been built on certain ideas, and often with disastrous or problematic results. So I think it's important to look at various versions of it and to sort of trace or track the differences among them, which sounds a little post-structural, but I really truly believe that we can't just look at the text itself. Not unlike idiots on the Supreme Court. So we sort of need to look at the system or the terrain of interpretation. And so in that particular case, I came across this interesting PowerPoint presentation done in Kazakhstan, thinking that this is a largely agricultural university, and in some of the former Soviet republics, it's you either have heavy industry in the cities and large swaths of agricultural enterprise, and pretty much that's the deal. They're not largely built on huge consumer cultures so much as they are more productive in that sense. They're designed for that kind of activity, which is why they can afford to contribute troops or do wacky things in their central government. But more specifically, I just imagine that there's somebody, who's preparing to go into Kazakhstan agribusiness, an undergraduate, I would assume, and they're getting PowerPoints that are not your standard, capitalist business school stuff. They're getting kind of stuff that looks like post-Soviet Marxism. And so you should sort of get this sense that, yes, there are parts of the world where people are trying to make this work and do make this work. I would assert to you that this is no different in a large number of quasi-socialist countries, and that this is, it's not opaque, hopefully. On the other hand, when you look at this PowerPoint demonstration, there are too many damn letters and too many damn primes. So it's a little, God only knows how these kids are learning this stuff. So anyway, and it's from 2015, so it's not that horribly old, but you can see that the first slide is the general formula, the Marxist general formula. Looking at contradictions is the second step. Interesting. Expanding the general formula into 4 circuits. Now, these aren't the same 4 circuits as some other people, and I will give you the diagram of kind of where I am with the 4 circuits. But there are circuits, and that's what volume 2 is about, is money capital, production capital, commodity capital, and the reproduction of labor power in this particular example. And the reproduction of labor power is the most important thing in some ways, because that's kind of what's going on, is culture, and so the general formula is, as it's always been, it doesn't change. quantitative expansion, money is alpha omega. I'm not quite sure what the author means by that, but money is a mediator, a commodity form. Capitalism as money making and greed. I'm sure he or she has, I think it's a he, has that particular point of view on this. Commodities are a mere means to an end. The metamorphosis of capital or of as value in that sense. There are contradictions. Then the source of the prime and M prime, which is the question of surplus value, essentially. So I assume that's it. Marx assumes equal exchange. That's the kind of presumption, that's sort of the constraint that is in volume 2. The reality is unequal exchange, that such as cheating would merely redistribute value. In other words, unequal exchange, it's not a static state. I mean, obviously there's a revolutionary possibility there. And the question, if it's not in circulation, then where the hell is it? And this is that productivist bias that, well, it's got to be somewhere. It doesn't go into the ground. It goes back into production. So there is a kind of circularity to it. And that's, I think, what the author means. And so there are several pages of all the same things that we do in our little non-Kazakhstan context. There's the same variables. Labor power, means of production process, C prime, M prime. And I won't rehearse all of this, but more interesting is the idea that there's endless expansion. The spiral is a good idea, I think, from an ideographic point of view to describe. And this is not the first time we've talked about spirals, but it's just nice to see it, however badly rendered, with bad graphics, in a Kazakhstan PowerPoint. And it gets a little more confusing down here when he tries to put all the algebra into all kinds of things. So you can disentangle this at your leisure, but it has, the logic is there. It's not problematic. All of this is okay. Where's labor power reproduced? Sometimes within the circuit, you're learning stuff. This is the knowledge question we brought up before, reading the manual. And then to a greater degree, and this is, I think, the point of all of the kind of extensions that have been made in the sort of post-productivist or consumption-oriented things that happened in post-Stalinist Marxism, and that is thinking about everyday life, about the reproduction of everyday life. And so, it's to talk about the family, talk about domestic production, all those things that got excluded by so many people. The things that weren't in the national income accounts. And so similarly, blah, 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 consumption, life goal of circuit, appropriate from the worker's point of view, inappropriate from capital's point of view, you lazy bastards. Anyway, so blah, 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 it just gets all but you can see this, that these are circuits. I think the general model, so I assume that we're going to, chapter 6, and you can see that he uses somebody else's, Arthur Bowe's diagram here. Not unlike me, I tend to like to figure out, well, what did ideographically the other author mean by their weird diagram? So, this one is a little complicated, but what it does is what volume 2 does and points to volume 3. The idea is that there's other stuff going on. The circuits mean that, on the one hand, you have this general productive model, but then you have little extensions, other things that are going on. And you can see that finance capital or merchant capital is at work, that there's a role for banks. The float is really big, that's where surplus sometimes hides. And we know this because people are taking their little surplus and putting it into the Caymans or whatever, and putting in yachts, whatever. These things happen. You can't make that crap up. They just exist. And then there are the references, which are interesting because, he's going to the text itself, right? Capital Volume 2 in the completed works. And then there's a variety of under manuscript stuff, references. And since this is probably being read not in Kazakh, but in Russian, so it's sort of interesting and amusing. And in Chukrov's book on railroading, that would be nice to sort of think about what does that mean in 19th century Russian railroad terms. But it is important because Marx talks about railroads and stuff, as I've mentioned before, the idea of means of communication, which he doesn't forget, and he thinks about it in a temporal way, about a kind of seasonal difference in the way communication operates, how trains and telegraphs run together in the 19th century. That is, you put your telegraph lines where your railroads are, or you put them in first, actually, because it's easier to put them in before you put your rail lines down. So, these are all very relatively, hopefully, simple ideas. So this is a summary of Simon Clarke's summary of Karl Marx's Capital Volume 2. And, we've looked at kind of a very quick survey, of course, of the 900 whatever pages of Volume 1. And Volume 2 builds on that, takes some of the things that were either not mentioned or held constant or whatever, because Volume 2 and Volume 3 do articulate a more complete sense of a capitalist model, the capitalist model, as it were, globalized capitalist model. And we have hints at that throughout the text and throughout Marx's other works. Marx wasn't simply concerned about, capitalism in one country. He was interested in the entire system, global system, some of which some people take as a kind of world model, which that's fine. But I think ultimately you still have to look at individual behavior in that context. And individual behavior only becomes group behavior almost instantaneously. So it's just idiotic to assume otherwise, which unfortunately some people do. So in Volume 2, Marx turns to the role of circulation in a capitalist society and examines the relationship between capitalist production and circulation. And yes, a lot of the discussion is detailed and technical, and we will skip, thank God. But the basic argument is fundamental to Marx's account of capitalist society and both modifies and complements the analysis of Volume 1. Marx's main concern is to show in a systematic and rigorous way that circulation is subordinate to production. And this is an important point only because this kind of productionist bias is important only simply because it from a subjectivity point of view, there's still people. It's about agency. And so production occurs at, individual, group, society, nation, global levels. And so, it's still productivist at the front end or back end. And so culture, however superfluous one might think of it, the unproductives, as it were, they're still productive. And unproductives are productive simply by the fact that they've been determined to be, like the lumpen, unproductive. The role of circulation is to provide a mechanism that can, through the exchange of products and the operation of markets, ensure that commodities of particular types, that is, particular use values, are produced in the quantities and the proportions required for the reproduction of the system. And this is that it perpetuates itself, not unlike the little alien chest burster that runs around killing and eating things, assimilating things. Thus, the market serves to coordinate the different branches of capitalist production. It regulates the social division of labor in a capitalist society as in simple commodity production. The secondary literature in Volume 2 of Capital, especially on the circuits of capital, is almost non-existent, which is an interesting observation, but it is actually true. And Volume 2 has incomplete elements in it. So, everyone kind of tries to do the best they can, I think. But ultimately, it's still the front-loaded of Volume 1. So Chapter 1, Volume 2. In the first 3 chapters, Marx looks at the circuit of capital from 3 different points of view. So you can get this sense of triangulation going on in the idea of looking at interrelated or nested circuits. The elements of the circuit are the same in each case, but approaching the same thing from different angles both gives a complete picture of the whole and an understanding of the kinds of illusions to which a partial view can rise. The basic circuit under examination is the circuit of industrial capital, composed of the purchase of labor power, L, or LP, as you saw on the slide, and means of production, MP, the act of production, and the sale of the commodities produced in a constantly repeated cycle. We're up to page 43 of the 76 pages of Simon Clark's summary. If we look at the cycle, starting from a sum of money capital, we have the circuit of money capital that is looked at in chapter 1, the standard diagram. In this formula, M is money capital, C is commodity capital, and I think it's important to remember this, that it is money dash capital and commodity dash capital. Here composed of the means of production and labor power, LP and MP. P is productive capital. C prime is, again, commodity capital, now composed of products. That is, it's a less abstract, more complete, more transformed, more put together, assembled. And M prime is, again, money capital is M plus, M, the change in M delta, whatever. Thus, M, C, M prime, C prime, M prime are various forms of capital appropriate to various phases in the circuit of industrial capital. Note, of course, that industrial capital is only one phase. We get through merchant capital, finance capital, blah, 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 blah. Now, what Marx wants to examine is these three different forms or differing forms of capital. What he wants to show is that these different forms of capital are not inherently capital, but only become capital because of their roles within the circuit as a whole. So there's interdependency. Thus, neither money nor commodities are inherently capital. This is an important idea that, Marx, because of Hegel or Feuerbach, blah, 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 is that not all of these are fully realized. They're kind of, maybe they seem epiphenomenal, but, they're there, sort of. It just, whatever. They're imagined in that sense. Number two, that the circuit as a whole is defined as a circuit of capital because it includes within it the capitalist process of production within which surplus value is produced. That's kind of where, that's the money shot. That's where we're supposed to get to. The idea that capitalism, operates kind of interestingly. It moves around, does stuff, but it also creates stuff, but it also creates surplus as well. And it you can see it empirically, and Marx spends a fair amount of time with these little numbers and adding and subtracting and all this arithmetic to try and show you that the basic algebra, that is all this M prime blah blah blah, actually sort of works. Thus, it is through their functional relationship to the production of surplus value that money and commodities within this circuit function as capital. Now, it's important to think of this as a function and the same functionality or functionalism that biology operates with. So this goes back to our Bellamy Foster thing about, science, that you can and talk about these things in that way. And it seems a little imprecise. It seems less like physical science, but natural science or naturalized science or cultural science is ultimately, all kind of interconnected, have structural things. Marx tries to show this by examining each form of capital in turn. The first stage of the circuit is the purchase of commodities with money, M-C. This act is not capitalist in itself. It is a simple act of circulation. Now, sure, you buy crap and blah, 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 and there's paperwork and, whatever. But the fact is, in its abstract, it's just an act of circulation don't get yourself too confused by the other stuff. Thus, there is nothing inherent within it to stamp either M or C as capital. We can wait to do that. Thus, what makes this act capitalist and M and C forms of capital is not the form of the act, but its material content. So materialism looks at it kind of like, I don't think these things are necessarily, we don't know how much they cost yet, sort of. The fact that C is made up of means of production and labor power in definite proportions, appropriate for capitalist production. We're going to work out the value questions in a little bit. Thus, C here takes the form of productive capital that can produce surplus value. Excuse me. It is only because the original money capital is turned into productive capital that it represents a form of capital. In itself, it performs only the functions of money. It purchases a set of commodities. Now, this is all quite neutralized, and the question of form is not as palpable as we would like it to be. And this is the whole argument of the value form that is, decades of arguing with each other about. Thus, the initial sum of money serves as capital because of its function within the circuit, which is to buy productive capital and so to make possible the production of surplus value. You need to, to buy stuff to make stuff, make more stuff. In the transformation of money capital and productive capital, the status of the two purchases, M-L and M-MP, is different. Means of production have to be purchased in order to set the labor power to work. Labor power is purchased because it's productive of surplus value. It's a little circular and tautological. And this is that thing that I was trying to show with the little table yesterday, is that there are interconnections here, but it can be, people want to categorize stuff, and you don't need to, kind of nail it all down at once. Thus, M-L, that is MPLP, is the core of the circuit, the characteristic transaction of the capitalist mode of production. Not simply because of the existence of wage labor, not because of the form of the transaction, but because the transaction is the prelude to the production of surplus value. It's only when the purchase of labor power becomes the means of producing surplus value, when labor power appears characteristically as a commodity. Note that, remember, we've decided that labor is not identical to labor power. Labor power is more the potentiality of it, and from which we often sort of skim things. It's kind of contract that the capitalist makes with the laborer that, you're going to work 40 hours, and you're going to work a good 40 hours for me, et cetera, et cetera. That such a purchase converts the money involved in it into money capital. So this is, the capitalist gets annoyed that they're not getting their money's worth. Thus, money does not become money capital simply by virtue of employing somebody, i.e. a servant, e.g. a servant. Consequently, M-L is only a phase in the circuit of capital, when the class relation between capital and labor is developed and the worker has been separated from the means of production and subsistence. In other words, the only way you're going to get any money or wages or whatever is because, I own all this stuff and I got the machinery, and, you got to work for me in order to blow up. And the class relation between capitalist and wage laborer therefore exists as presupposed from the moment that the two face each other in the act M-L. This is very important. It means that the exchange of money for labor power is not a relation between two individual commodity owners. Thus, it does not have the form of exchange analyzed in volume 1. It's not fully, embraced. It maybe is a kind of promise. It's an exchange between individual members of two. Remember, we talked about antagonisms, right? The Zizek and the antagonism of the commons. Two antagonistic social classes. And let's just think that's not important. It's clear that in 2020, Trump tried to create antagonism among social classes by, in one instance, he actually sent a death squad, and whether he did or didn't send, frankly, I wish the Department of Justice would pin it down. But technically, there was a death squad sent to kill this one guy who killed a right-wing demonstrator in Portland. They actually cornered the guy, didn't really give him an opportunity to surrender, and they just gunned him down. Now, it is the case that this guy actually did shoot some one of these idiots with bear spray. The guy squirted him with bear spray. The guy pulled out a gun and shot the guy with the bear spray. So pretty much, justice is sort of served, but only in a kind of medieval sense. It is this class relation between capital and labor that is the basis of capitalist production, and so that makes possible the transformation of money into capital. Thus, the economic categories examined in the circuit of capital reveal on examination a definite set of social relations lying behind them. Now, this lying behind, hidden behind, whatever, obscured. It is the social relations that make it possible for money to act as capital. Thus, the circuit of money capital, in which money appears to generate surplus value on examination, presupposes the circuit of productive capital, within which, as we shall see, the purchase of labor power by money is subordinate to the production of surplus value, i.e., the role of money is simply to bring together the elements for the production of surplus value. This is a set of promises. I'm hiring you at X dollars. blah, blah, blah per hour. You're going to produce stuff, and I'm going to skim off some of that stuff. The circuit also presupposes the development of commodity production on an extensive scale. And remember, scale is still really important for this growth deal. The capitalist must have money capital to start with, and this must come from the prior sale of commodities. So this whole thing about, startups and, nest eggs and blah, 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 all that's, really important. Pre-existing wealth of some kind. The workers must be able to buy commodities with their wages if they are to reproduce their labor power. That is, you need your Wheaties in order to, make stuff. Hence, capitalist production is also the generalization, so this is at scale, of commodity production. Thus, the separation of the worker from his or her means of production and subsistence, which is the basis for the extensive development of commodity production, is again to be found to be a condition of the circuit of capital. If we look at the stage of productive capital, we see the capitalist setting means of production and labor power to work. It is not, however, their character as means of production or labor power that makes these factors of production into capital. It is only because of their role, the social role in the production of surplus value, that they become capital. Thus, labor power is simply a commodity in the hands of the worker. You're out there chopping your wood to, stay warm. Only becoming capital when bought by the capitalist, while the means of production only function as capital when combined with labor power. So it is the synthesis of all of these matters. Once again, it's only the historically developed social relations in which the capitalist monopolizes means of production and subsistence. It's my company. And so confronts free labor, these folks running around outside the Home Depot, that give labor power and means of production, productive capital, their character of forms of capital. Capitalist production finishes up with commodities. As a result of capitalist production, these are the form of commodity capital. That is, you get that stuff out there, but it's got to get on the market, and it's got to, be exchanged somehow. Transactions need to occur. Again, there's nothing in the commodities themselves or in their sale that makes them capital. This is this idea that throughout looking at these kinds of ideas that we need to think, unfortunately or fortunately, in abstraction. It's a structure of these relations that makes these things work, not necessarily any one thing in and of itself. It is in context or foregrounded and backgrounded, etc. They are capital because of their role in the circuit of capital. It's the bodily form of the valorized capital. Bodily form of the valorized capital. Capital plus surplus value. This is that moment that we saw in volume 1, this idea of valorization, where you make something out of it. You make this kind of abstract value. And from that abstraction, the process of abstraction, you can see that more is being made and more can be appropriated. Just as the original money capital was a form of capital because it prefigured the process of production of surplus value, so commodity capital is a form of capital because it expresses it. As I've mentioned before, language has two elements in it. A communicative element, simply that it is, the information gets transmitted, a sender to receiver, etc., in the Shannon model. But there is also an expression that comes with it. We need to know, numbers are assigned to this of one kind or another, or metal is assigned to this, or something. So there's an expression as well as the exchange itself, for example. The sale of the commodities that comprise commodity capital is a realization of the capital value and surplus value embodied in those commodities. So realization is not a simple moment, but a system of moments. While capital in the form of commodity capital awaiting a seller in the market, it is not creating new value. So it is not creating surplus value. So this is where we get back to the issue of, where is the surplus value? Well, the one way to explain it, and that's why labor theory of value kind of works for some people, because if you're talking to a worker, how come I don't get surplus value? Well, you could get it. You can make up an example where you're arbitraging it, you're selling it for even more money or whatever. But in our simple model here, the surplus value is only being extracted at the production level. Thus, the amount of surplus value a capital can produce in a certain time depends on the amount of time it is tied up as commodity capital. The more rapidly a capital can be turned over. This is the way, the way the market goes, right? You need to follow the entire thing all the way through the supply chain, blah, 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 the more surplus value you can produce. So, it's not just the production at the front end, but it's the complete version of it out to market. Some poor sucker in the a car dealership, being ripped off by fees and blah, blah, blah. Let me talk to my manager. This is a whole system of things. This introduces a determinant of the rate of surplus value other than the rate of exploitation. So rate of exploitation, sort of more happens at the production level or relative to the surplus value when, where the stuff is getting skimmed for your wages. But the reality, of course, is that it requires all this other crap going on, the motion of the system. With the sale of commodity capital, the original capital is restored to its money form. In other words, it verifies that the contract of, well, I did buy, I got this car at the MSRP, but then there were all these stupid fucking fees and taxes. From the point of view of the original capital, the whole circuit is simply a series of changes in form. That's kind of important to think about how value form is not one thing, but many things, always changing like a terrible lava lamp. However, the transformation of commodity capital into money also represents the realization of surplus value in the form of money for the first time. In other words, if you can complete and turn over the production of widgets, and then, all the way to the end where somebody goes into the store, puts down their money and buys the fucking thing, that you get a kind of more complete cycle. And of course, it has an even more completion if you use, let's say you're buying a gun, you're going to go rob a bank or whatever. It can go much further, or like war at the much larger scale. Thus, the final money capital, M prime, plays two roles. It restores the original capital to the money form, this is accounting, and it realizes the surplus value. So you don't get verification of this theft of your value or the surplus value until the whole set of transactions turns over. This final sum of money is, again, capital only because of its functional role in the circuit of capital. It is only because the commodities which are sold and the embodiment of the original capital plus the new surplus value that the sum of money their sale realizes is a sum of money capital. So time is involved here. Space is involved here as well. So you've got to think about, all these things that are going on in motion. Then, you can see why people, this just must be like physics, like flows, like water or air. If the circuit of money capital is looked at as a whole in summary form, it looks as though it is the original capital that has given rise to the surplus value on its own. It appears that the surplus value is the product of the original capital rather than deriving from the process of production. So this is this question of whether you see it as static or dynamic. This is the irrational expression of money capital. Irrational because money cannot breed money on its own. This is the money bin problem. Marx has tried to show that it is only in the relation to the production of surplus value in the circuit of capital that the original sum of money, the productive capital, the commodity capital, and the final sum of money are all forms of capital. These are all forms of capital. This is a point not necessarily made clear in volume 1, even though he does sort of say it, but it's so many concepts that you kind of get lost, particularly when he front ends the issue of the commodity. But the commodity is the way at a level of abstraction, a way to talk about capital. It is the entry point. In themselves, they are only money or commodities with no miraculous powers of self-expansion. I mean, it's true that you can see expansion. This is not to deny expansion, but they don't do them on themselves. They only do it in a system. Thus, the final form of money capital, M prime, M plus delta M, contains no trace of the process of production from which it derived its character as capital. So note you're already at one level because you don't really see how it got made. Some things appear to us as magic. There's just illusory that it just looks so shiny. How did it get so fucking shiny? Well, it's hours of sitting there at a buffing wheel, or whatever. That you need to think about, what counts in all of these cases, even if it is nice, bright, shiny, beautiful. I can see myself in the shine. Anyway, when we examine the circuit as a whole, we see that only the process of production that is a real metamorphosis of capital is compared with a purely formal metamorphosis of circulation. So that's the business. We have to look at the thing in its totality, but not to reify it as such. Within the circuit, money capital, productive capital, commodity capital are not independent capitals, but are different forms of industrial capital, each with a functional role to fulfill in the circuit of industrial capital. And make an aside here, even if you're an artisan, all of these things are going on if you ultimately sell your artwork or whatever. If you pick a division of labor like a gallery or an agent to sell it, that's a different thing. Or if you go to a fair to sell, you can see that it's still an industry technically, just at a very small scale. It is only as forms of industrial capital that the money and commodities in question function as capital. But because capital has to pass through all these functional forms, it can be blocked. That is, in the form of a hoard of money bin, a stock of unsold commodities, Trump Truth Social, or idle labor and idle means of production, with the result that the production of surplus value and so accumulation of capital is slowed. This is quite normal with regard to fixed capital. That is, a certain amount of capital is immobilized in the form of machines. Transport and communications, like gold production, are exceptional in that the product does not take an independent commodity form. Similarly, there are free ports where people, the art technically is in transit, so you can't be taxed on it. So, my Van Gogh is in a free port, whatever, somewhere, so I don't have to, pay taxes on it or its transfer, etc. And it's been there for several years, whatever. That's the kind of thing, that's how free ports operate relative to to trade, etc. Before the era of capitalist production, commodity capital, that is merchants, and money capital, bankers, existed as independent forms of capital. Now, this is that question of, as I've mentioned before, the Italian banks, etc. Mercantilism and merchant capital exists in various other forms. And yes, without being anti-Semitic, that's why the relative autonomy of the Jews actually works into this kind of favor in terms of the surplus. But it wasn't always the Jews. Arabic cultures have their own form of a certain way in which they accumulate and transfer wealth. That is a sort of bypass wealth system. It is, in fact, how 9/11 was financed, for example. With the rise of capitalist production, and so of industrial capital, in which capital is involved in the production, as well as the appropriation of surplus value, money capital, and commodity capital, lose their independence. These are all interdependent and become simply functional forms of industrial capital, subordinate to it, subordinate to the whole. Looking at the circuit of industrial capital from the starting point of money capital imposes a particular perspective. Remember, we looked at this in the idea that you had several different perspectives on the entire circuit of capital. Makes it clear that the purpose of production is exchange value and not use value. The whole point is to get it out there and move it so that the process of production appears merely as an unavoidable intermediate link. Production itself is seen as merely the means of expanding value in between two phases of circulation. It portrays the generation of surplus value explicitly as the basis of the circuit of capital by expressing in the money form. How expensive are those Keebler cookies? Since there is no change of form between the beginning and the end of the circuit, its aim can only be to increase the quantity of value. This form of the circuit of capital does not include individual consumption, but only productive consumption of labor power and means of production, although it implies that the laborers are in fact consuming. I eat some cookies from the Keebler assembly line. Thus, at the end of the circuit, M prime is available for further accumulation so that the circuit expresses simply the process of self-expansion and accumulation. So we're looking at multiple phases or time periods, multiple systems or steps of exchange. All of these things are going on, and it just keeps moving forward. You got to keep the damn shark moving. Although in some respects, the circuit of money capital is the most striking and typical form in which the circuit of industrial capital appears. It is also misleading if it is treated in isolation. This is the problem of, in fact, how it's taught in business schools. It gives rise to the illusion of the monetary system that surplus value derives from circulation, and that the illusion of the mercantile system that the purposes of accumulation is to accumulate money. This is the money bin problem again, Scrooge McDuck and his money bin. The former illusion is dissipated when it is realized that the circuit depends on capitalist production, so points to the circuit of productive capital. The latter illusion is dissipated when it's realized that the single circuit, just one of these multiple circuits we're looking at, embedded circuits, is part of an endless repetition of the circuit as money capital is thrown back in. Thus, the aim is renewed accumulation, not the hoarding of money. Okay, so I think I got to the end of, pretty much of what I wanted to say for today. I probably will, yammer more about this. I had proposed, had I got through earlier, just simply to review or show again at 1.25 speed the first lecture by Andy Higginbottom. And so at that moment, I inserted this PowerPoint of from Kazakhstan, and noted, of course, that you can see how some of us use other people's diagrams. So this is Arthur Bowe's circuits of capital and money used by this fellow in Kazakhstan. So just to give you a sense of where the next bit of yakking we'll talk about, chapter 2, volume 2. Don't worry, it goes faster. The whole section on volume 2 is really much shorter than the volume 1 summary by Simon Clark. So this is Simon Clark speaking. I devoted a lot of attention to chapter 1 because once you've gotten the points in that chapter, that is volume 2, chapter 1, clear, the rest is fairly straightforward. Marx has looked in considerable detail at the circuit of money capital in order to show, most fundamentally, that within a capitalist society, circulation is subordinate to production. It is within the sphere of production that surplus value is produced. Now, this is a key point because some people will say that it's not produced there. There's literally a literature that will say that surplus value does not occur in the intersection of labor or labor power and the means of production. And we can fight about this all we want, and it's a reasonable point of view, if only because there's a significant amount of literature to look at in terms of knowledge production, the way financial capital operates, and blah 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 blah. But the fact is, you still got to wear clothes and blah blah blah. So until we get replicators, there still is going to be a fucking industrial capital. So when we get to replicators, maybe that's not going to happen, but we're not there yet. I assume that we will if we have a kind of Star Trek optimism. So therefore, that's my warning. That is the argument here, and this is the key point of all looking at orthodox Marxism. Circulation is subordinate to production, is within the sphere of production that surplus value is produced. Now, what is not answered further is whether surplus value could be produced elsewhere and still simply is reflected in the entire systematic process. In other words, if I got more surplus capital, surplus value, that is or is not profit at some other element, how do I cope with that if it's not industrial? So you need this, it's about definitions and trying to get the, stuff right. And as I said, the quantitative advances, I think, that Marxism itself has made, that is Paul Koshon and a bunch of other people who want to, integrate better in an algorithmic way, blah, 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 the mathematical models that essentially are Marxist. You won't even call them Marxism again, but as I've said, if the Fed could do Marxist analysis, it might actually, we could actually go to the site, see, oh, okay, well, that's how much surplus value is being created in this sector of the economy. Circulation has a role to play in providing the capitalists with the requisite labor power and means of production, and realizing commodity capital embodying both the original capital and the surplus value, but it is only in their relation to capitalist production that money capital and commodity capital become forms of capital. However, the circuit of money capital does not directly reveal the centrality of production. This is this question of the value form again, yet again. And we can, it's arguable. It's fine to argue it. Just don't, it's not the hill you want to, it's not the hill that I'm going to die on. Thus, in chapter 2, Marx moves on to look at the circuit of capital from a different point of view, starting with production. Because he's just introduced the kind of framework that shows, there's a kind of, sequence, let's say. Maybe it's just sequential in that context. The circuit of productive capital complements the circuit of money capital in drawing attention to two central features concealed by the latter. That is, money capital, the veil, conceals central features. The role of production, right? Keebler cookies must be made in trees by elves. It must be. That's where those cute little guys live. The character of the circuit as a part of the constant reproduction of capital. So character, whatever that might mean, appearance in the Hegelian context. Instead of production appearing as an interruption to circulation, circulation now appears simply as a means of production. So guys in advertising agencies who are connected to people in marketing and merchandising, they've all convinced us that there are these little elves running around, Smurf-like figures, baking cookies in trees. And of course, the interesting amusement is the appropriation of the meaning and then the transformation in the ad. They're made in factories, whatever. If the capitalist consumes the entire surplus value, the whole cookie bag, this leaks out of the circuit and we have simple reproduction anyway. So I'll talk more about this on. And I will begin the review process again because Lecture 5 has not yet been produced by or released by Andrew Higginbottom. And so reviewing, and because I think we still should review this, and I know that Higginbottom does a very thorough job of explaining the entire interrelation of the 3 volumes of Capital, that we will start looking at the beginning, Lecture 1, of Higginbottom's presentation on Volume 2 of Karl Marx's Capital, Das Kapital. So that's where I'm going to stop. You can ask questions. We'll continue to complete this little thing. Talks about go up through the chapters. You can see this is not quite that long, and it doesn't have any math. And we will get to the end of Volume 2 in the next segment. It is useful to look at, of course. Then let me just make a comment about the literature. Probably the thing that is underread is Paul Swayze's theory of capitalist development, which is a magnum opus. And it shows in some ways that, Harvard's good for some things. And then, Radulsky, Grossman, which is on the Marx.org site, and then Capital and Class as an article. This article by Bellini on underconsumption. Underconsumption and overproduction are key concepts that we will see continuing on, and there will be centuries of discussion of this. Needless to say, this is where Rosa Luxemburg sort of is, engaged, certainly. And then there's Ben Fein's analysis of Marx's Capital, which is still a useful book because simply it's got diagrams. And then Clark has his own book on the theory of crisis, because there's still this problematic model on transformation, organic composition, underconsumption, overproduction, blah, 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 blah. So the classic underconsumptionist interpretation of Marx's Rosa Luxemburg's The Accumulation of Capital, her magnum opus. All right, and so I included the links to lectures 1, 2, 3, and 4 if you're amused by that and want to put that on your, pod. And then there's this little article by this one guy. I don't think he's ever taught economics. He's like a retired engineer. I think he's a French guy. Maybe it might be French Canadian, but he always has really interesting stuff because he sort of knows the math. And so this diagram. This is his diagram. And so this is the little article describing the multiple overlapping circuits of capital, of the circuits of capital. And he does it in a way that Marx does it with little bracket things. This guy does it with squares, and that may be like a simple matter, but if you kind of are interested in the way categories and surfaces are sort of work, this is kind of amusing from maybe the graphic point of view. And so therefore, he does a very brief little thing, and he confesses that he's been reading Steve Resnick and Rick Wolf, and that there's Althusser and stuff going on. So quite amusing to me anyway. And so Robert Villeneuve, put a little thing in here, and I think his sort of fussing around and came up with this nice little diagram, which I kind of like as a diagram. It's just very useful. You can see that there's the circuit of money capital, the circuit of productive capital, and the circuit of commodity capital. You can see their kind of position in the basic Marx's original diagram. And then you see this fourth little circuit called advanced capital. And I would assert to you, with all due respect, this is where you can sort of see the entry point for advanced capital of, where you begin to say, well, okay, merchant capital does this, and financial capital does this. So this moment in Marxian theory where you get the questions about finance, that's kind of where that sits. And it's very pedagogically useful to sort of say, oh, okay, well, this is where it is. And as you can see, it overlaps with the other things that produce surplus value. So this is not mystifying in that sense. It just simply is part of the system. Okay, now I'll finally stop and you can, yeah. Anyone?
I got 3 questions.
Yeah. Everyone's asleep. Yes, ask away.
First one is, you mentioned the death squad that Trump sent out. If you could just remind me what took place there, who had the bear spray, who shot who all that stuff.
Okay.
The second question is Freeport. Why and how do people allow this shit to happen? And the third question is, you mentioned Keebler cookies. Are they really made by elves?
I don't know. I've never seen a Keebler cookie factory. And I suspect that since Keebler also makes Girl Scout cookies, that there's some pedo thing going on with miniature men and small girls. But maybe not. Anyway.
And are the elves in a union?
Indeed. There's no mention of a trade unionist activity in. There probably is one in the actual Keebler factory, but anyway, yes. So let me. I think I missed the middle question. So let me start with and then you can mention your second question again because my short-term memory just lost it. During 2020, there was literally an entire year of protests of one kind or another that occurred in Portland. And there's a lot of anarchist, anarcho thingamajob, blah, blah. And then there's a lot of right-wing Proud Boys. There's some other Christian nationalist, neo-Nazi, blah, blah, all in the Pacific Northwest. And all of these things converged in demonstrations in Portland, and depending on how you want to read the process, there were massive demonstrations against the federal building, and it continued on, and there was a period where unidentified or unbadged groups of a combination of what Trump had organized of tactical officers from other federal agencies. So you had the tax squad from some prisons, Bureau of Prisons, Customs and Border Patrol, since Portland is within the 100-mile, province that goes all the way around the United States of the Border Patrol. 100 miles inland, in other words, is the Border Patrol can still operate, and other DHS officers and other kinds of federal officers that could be easily peeled off from putting down riots in prisons and stuff, because there really aren't very many of those, with all respect. And so you create these little hit squads, and in one particular instance, since they're very good at what they do, with all due respect to how law enforcement is trained, particularly in the period since of the Iraq War, is that you have a lot of former military in the police force, so they kind of are used to doing snatch and grab and clearing rooms and shit like that, and they do a good job of it. So on the one hand, there were people being snatched off the fucking street, totally unidentified in Portland. So there was a bunch of that behavior going on, and there's video of it where somebody gets that's walking around and they get nabbed.
Yeah.
And so you have these kind of hit squads running around, and they're put together in kind of a very loose and probably not well documented way. And so therefore, during one set of demonstrations where you had, I recall that it was in the same set of demonstrations where the right-wing Nazi types were riding in pickup trucks with paintball guns, and they were shooting at left-wing demonstrators. And so, not in the midst, but actually sort of after one of these things where sort of people were kind of dispersing or whatever, there were a bunch of thugs running around, walking down the street, being just bad guys. And so, a confrontation occurs, and there's some video of this. Obviously somebody yelled at somebody else. The right-wing guy is holding a can of bear spray and squirts this other guy who happens to be armed. I don't think he has his gun out. So I think what occurs is, sort of self-defense in that sense, because, gets squirted with bear spray, and the other guy pulls out his handgun and shoots the guy, and needless to say, kills him. And so people take this seriously particularly if if the homicide occurs. So therefore, there's issues and blah, 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 blah. But at some moment, while they're kind of track this guy down, ultimately, they figure out who is this guy, blah, 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 blah. And he's, part of blah, 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 a kind of leftist, sort of whatever group. They figure out where he is, where he's staying, I think, or something. He's either in his car, getting in his car, getting out of his car, or whatever. And they just pounce on him. Not on him physically, they just simply surround him. He steps out and they shoot him to death, and that's pretty much it. I assume there's a lot of documentation, relative to this and that and the other thing, but that stuff happens. No real consequences. I don't think there was any after investigation or whatever of what occurred, but this was a group of combined with various folks. I think there were some state police involved, some whatever. It's just not very clear, and I'm not well reported on, with all respect. They just gunned him down. It was it wasn't like they tried to take him into custody. With all respect,
no, just shoot him.
It seems pretty fucking clear that they just shot him to death, and that's kind of sad. So yes, a death squad. That's what I meant by death squad.
I mean, if they can do that one time, they can do it multiple times. So This stuff should not be allowed to happen
Well, in the
without
context of
consequence.
Portland, it seemed pretty clear, and particularly the way Trump treated it, was that he was trying to gin this up in his sort of American carnage stuff, and so that this was it's necessary to come in with even more force. And there were just a lot of really bad situations where a lot of people were deeply injured or killed because of stupid behavior on the law enforcement part. But yes, it is true that there were people who were itching for confrontation and et cetera, et cetera. So there's other, left elements that, in an accelerationist way, believe that, that's kind of, the revolution is going to come. But I think as we've seen in American history, that it's kind of hard to get those things going.
Yeah.
And it is a continuing discourse problem within the left. It's like, well, we're not going to have a revolution yet because you just don't have need a critical mass. You need to get everyone, and it's this thing. So we've all got to have solidarity. So we're going to be. We're going to be purists about our political positions, so therefore we can get everyone together, and this will happen. Not really. It's not. And so if that's not a model, then we have other versions of this throughout history. We need to have a revolutionary vanguard, blah blah blah, and let's got to, how are we going to finance this? Now we got to rob banks, blah blah blah, and then you can see how all this gets crazy. Now it's not necessarily a left ideology, as we've seen. There's a right ideology for this as well, and it's clear that there was all these militia groups that and they usually get to a certain point where they can't afford to do whatever they're going to do if they're not being sponsored by rich folks. They need to get capital, so they go out and rob stuff. And they usually get caught because the apparatus has been there for quite a while, how to catch bad people, bad guys who do simple crimes like robbery.
Yeah.
Well, you know what I always say, Professor Ann? There are good people on both sides. Good radicals. The radical right and the radical left. They're all so lovely. My favorite people.
Well, in some ways, they're all integrated in that sense that, at one moment, that in the case of those idiots in Michigan who may or may not have conspired to try and kidnap the governor of Michigan, is it the FBI who gave them the idea or not?
Many
Yeah, I
people
mean,
say the Nazis of World War II with a convergence.
Well,
Mr. Trump, were some of them good people too?
it's a tough time
And
in
this
the 30s.
this is James. I had a question regarding your capitalism and communism and so on. In view of the steamrolling of the American system of, I don't know, the private equity buying up everything. Like right now, I have a friend who's fighting a development in north of San Francisco Bay here by a bunch of out-of-town carpetbagger investors that want to come in and build this huge development, screw up traffic flow for everyone. And they don't give a shit about any of the implications of it. And fortunately, he's fighting back with CEQA and so on. But the ultimate goal of these people, the avalanche of private capital, is their dream world is we own nothing. We rent everything, and hopefully with a subscription to keep certain aspects of what we're renting operational.
Yep.
Sponsored by Star Trek.
Fuck y'all. That is
So does
not
this
part
change?
of Star Trek.
Does this change anything in terms of economic theory that, like what you've been going over? Are these people making an in run around organization of labor and so on? I mean, how do you fight back with these people?
I don't know. I mean, if you're visceral about it, you blow up computers, which is really kind of silly, but you could do that, I suppose. But, I'm not advocating anything. It just seems to me that we need to think in a much more consistent and structural way about all of these things. And I think we can get there. It's just that it's going to take some real transformations. Everyone's doing a kind of short-term deal. I mean, it was important in the Chinese case to, as with Deng Xiaoping, et cetera, is, well, no, we just gotta, use a little bit more capitalism here, because if the country needs it, we need to make more people less poor and or not poor, and so you see this general movement, and that's why China owns America in terms of debt and a bunch of other shit.
There was some anti-China wrangling shenanigans
Indeed.
within the Ministry of Defense at the moment.
Yeah. Oh, indeed. Well, no,
Have
that's
you
been
heard
going
about this?
wow. That's been going on for a while. A bunch of people.
Nah, the cap badges.
Oh, the cap badge.
The new cap badges, I think it's for the Royal Artillery, if I remember rightly. Made in China. And the rest of the army is not happy about that, because they may contain tracking devices.
Oh, there we go.
And that's real. That's not a joke. That's not. It's not April Fool's. It's not.
Hey, that's what happens. There's that Stalinist thing. I mean,
but of course, there are calmer heads within the Ministry of Defense have said, just calm the fuck down.
Yeah,
like if we they're saying if we actually stopped and thought about how much Chinese tech we're reliant on, you might get a bit too panicky.
Indeed. So let me sign off for now, because I've gone over my normal time, and thank you for your attention. As I say, we're continuing on. We're sort of doing volume 2 of Capital with a lot of review, and I'm just filling in these little points here, just as I was doing with, because it's about me trying to figure some of this out too, when I was talking about the different pairs of fixed and circulating and a constant and variable capital, which are sort of subgroups of talking about this larger commodity capital issue. So I hope it's not too complicated. It's, for me, doing this is to help clarify my own little deal. I don't hold the hope that I would actually go back into the classroom, because that's not really my goal, but just yakking helps me sort of work through some of these kinds of things. But there's other stuff I need to do, and there may be a moment where I will do a sub thing that is much more quantitative, just simply to get it out there, get it recorded, so that there's something left if I if I leave this mortal coil. So on that note, I'll